Hello everyone. In today's video we're going to have a look at the scenario Fatal Frequencies for Cthulhu Confidential. If you don't already know, Cthulhu Confidential is a noir-style detective RPG with Cthulhu mythos influences. It plays with just one player and one GM and uses the Gumshoe 1-to-1 system by Pelgrane Press. If you want a more in-depth overview of the Cthulhu Confidential system, check out my longer review. And Fatal Frequencies is the second scenario in the core book after the Fathomless Sleep. Fatal Frequencies features a new player character and a new city, Vivian Sinclair and Hard-Boiled New York. For each scenario in the core book we have three sections: the character, the city, and the scenario itself. Again, I will go through each of these individually, and you can safely watch the first two sections without any spoilers. And I will put a spoiler warning just before we move on to the scenario. Okay, let's get started. So first we meet Vivian Sinclair. She is a noir journalist working for the New York Herald Tribune. She's earned some grudging respect from her colleagues and has worked up to being one of the Herald Tribune's top investigative journalists. The player is asked to come up with Viv's biggest scoop and the difficulties that went with it from the last year. So some suggestions are maybe an investigative report on working conditions among the city's longshoremen, proving the innocence of a socialite heiress accused of murdering her father for her inheritance, and exposing the pseudo-kidnapping of an actress's child as a bid to regain the public's attention. I think these prompts are a little bit better than those for Dex in the previous scenario. They allow for a little bit more creativity on the part of the player and can create extra tension that might come up in this scenario or in future scenarios. For example, excuse me. For example, that heiress that you cleared of any wrongdoing might be willing to help you out with something, while the true criminal now has a personal grudge against you. What if only that person has the information that you need? How are you going to get it from them? But now it moves on to the gender issue. So we talked a little bit about that before in the first issue in the first scenario, where they said we're more used to seeing a white male detective getting beaten up by the police, and other than that, for people of color, for characters of color or female characters, it might be difficult for the player to witness them getting beaten up. But in this scenario, obviously we have a female detective, and there's a few things to consider here. First, there's a sidebar making it clear that Vivian is a lady detective and not a femme fatale, pointing out that there are very few examples of noir lady detectives in this setting. We see a lot of femme fatales, and it suggests that you can use someone like Jessica Jones or Elizabeth Salander, who was from the Girl with the Dragon Tattoo series, as inspirations. Obviously those are modern versions. Elsewhere it suggests that while Viv is less likely to end up in hospital from a beating compared to, say, Dex in the previous one, there are other consequences for her, such as emotional trauma, and maybe her subjects will be want some revenge, and the people around her getting hurt, and maybe she'll lose her job. Another point here is that fighting is a skill on your character sheet, but it doesn't always mean punching people. It can also mean being evasive or using the situation to your advantage. So realistically, Vivian is not going to deck or knock out a much larger man with one punch, but she will have other ways of getting around the situation, using maybe his balance to her, or his unbalance to her advantage, or something like that. But of course it mentions, well, if you and your player want her punching and flipping, that really pulp style, of course you can do it. It's an RPG. It just takes a little bit more adjustment on the part of the GM for the challenges, but it's very minimal, really. Just be aware that not everyone is comfortable with the thought of women getting beaten to a pulp, even in a game. So make sure your player is okay with that, because we play games for fun. If your player is okay with that, then yeah, go ahead. We also get a longer section on sexism in the workplace and men not taking women seriously. Of course, this was and continues to be a problem. However, I would just offer a word of warning not to have all of the male characters in any of these scenarios stereotypically, cartoonishly sexist or evil. I think we've seen in some recent movies that it can make the characters flat and one-dimensional and lead to dull scripts. Now, we don't need them to be good, but maybe not just sexist for the sake of being sexist. And equally, Vivian, the player character will not be perfect. And that's shown up in the cards, that the problem cards that our characters get is that they're not perfect, they're not flawless. And equally, our flawed villains are not all just purely terrible people. They don't need to be redeemed, but just to avoid that cartoonish evil, cartoonish kind of sexist trope. Now, it makes them certainly easier to hate, but it doesn't give as deep a feeling to the scenario, in my opinion. As I said before, RPGs, play them the way you like them. Next, there is also an optional section on bisexuality, which you can include to make Vivian bisexual or lesbian. And this is completely up to you. If you want to include that, if you and your player want to include it, great. If not, leave it out. So we also get a sidebar on violence, and rather than rephrase or even misquote it, I'll give it to you as it is. It's quite short. Sexual violence. For a lady detective, the explicit or implicit threat of sexual violence is often par for the course. However, though few authors follow through on such threats, many GMs and players may not wish to encounter this aspect of life in any form at the table. Consider alternative threats which still provide adequate menace. This company has very deep pockets, Miss Sinclair. Do you think any newspaper in the country would hire you once we won a libel suit that cost the Herald Tribune thousands? So yeah, I think that's a very fair point as well. Make sure that both the GM and the player are comfortable with anything like that. As I said, as they mention here, even authors that do use this, rarely follow through, and I would certainly not go into much detail on this. But if you wanted maybe a slightly realistic one, you might include some threats or some veiled reference to it. But absolutely, check with your player or get to know your player first before you look at anything like that. I think this little excerpt here gives you a really great alternative to that, and this is set during the Great Depression, so losing your job is a very big problem. Okay, so just before we move on to the sources, there are a few core connections that are not sources. There is Lawrence Ames, maybe? A-M-E-S, who is a rival journalist at the Times. There's also Emma Sinclair Lowell, who is Viv's wealthy aunt. And there is also Catherine Evans, Viv's roommate, who kind of gives a little bit of grounding, a little bit of a slice of the normal life to Viv. But equally, Viv's actions may potentially put Catherine in danger. So that's something to consider. But now we move on to the sources. So again, sources are knowledgeable people that Viv knows that can help her out. This has two main benefits. One, it shows that Viv doesn't know everything, but she knows people who might be able to help her out, which is very reminiscent of the whole noir style. And also, when Viv is interacting with potentially suspects or potentially dangerous people, if you're constantly doing that, it can be a little bit intense. And by meeting with the friendly contacts, friendly sources, it can help relieve some of that tension, because a one-to-one gaming experience can be quite intense as well. So anyway, here are her sources. The first one is Estelle, or Stella Abrams, who is an amateur occultist. She's always exploring new occultist avenues. When she sees something, oh, let me check this out, and then maybe quickly she's on to something else. So while she switches between them pretty rapidly, she never discards her books, and as such she is a great source on anything occult related. She had a fling with Viv while Viv was investigating, undercover doing an investigation on a drug smuggling ring. Up next we have Lieutenant Joseph O'Connor, who is a detective. He spoke out at a trial about corruption in the police force, and this impressed Viv. And when they later met on a case, Viv impressed him with her hunger for the truth, and they kind of complement each other quite well, because he understands and, you know, works with a lot of kind of low class criminals, but Viv knows kind of higher society or higher class people, and so they can kind of help each other out there. He could even potentially shake down a suspect for Viv, or maybe even bring them in for questioning. The only thing is, he knows that he ruffled a few feathers with his speaking out against the police force, so he might be a bit of trouble to be friends with as well. Up next is Esteban Manuel Aragon is right, yeah, Gonzalez, who is an explorer. He is the son of Cuban immigrants to New York, and he's always had a passion for architecture and exploring. Now he acts as a guide and a planner for people going on expeditions to places like Egypt and China and Peru. Between expeditions he works at the American Museum of Natural History, and he met Viv when they were on an expedition together. He was working as an archaeologist and she was working as a journalist. Both of them, it was a National Geographic expedition a few years ago, and they're happy to meet up and kind of discuss anything. So he's someone that she can kind of throw ideas at, and maybe he can give her some insight into it. The next source is Louisa Reynolds, who is a nurse. She is Vivian's third cousin and from the rich side of the family. And when she married her husband, who is a prominent psychologist, everyone expected her to retire, which is proper, or which was deemed proper for a lady of her standing. But actually her husband appointed her as the head nurse of a sanitarium that he works at, or one of the sanitariums he's involved with. And she loves that position, and she uses the library there extensively to further her own study, her own education, her own research. Viv was doing some reporting on the conditions at different sanitariums around the city, and this one she found was surprisingly modern and humane for the 1930s. And from that, Viv and Louisa became friends, and even though Louisa is not a doctor, she has a wide amount of practical experience in medicine and psychology and stuff like that. And then excuse me, finally there is Annette, or Nettie Rice, who is a professor. This is actually Vivian's former professor, and when Viv was in college, she didn't really think that much of Professor Nettie. Not good or not bad, just not a strong impression. But a few years later, Viv met up with her on a case, and Viv really admires her dedication to teaching and to the students, despite always being busy with so much paperwork. She notices that Nettie consumes an ungodly amount of coffee, and you can sometimes see her hand shaking from it. Nettie always thinks that Viv should apply the scientific method more to her investigations, and she's always trying to encourage that. So those are the sources, and after that we have a select bibliography to help you get the tone right for your game. Okay, so now we will move on to hard-boiled New York. Remember, this is not the Roaring Twenties, but the 1930s. Prohibition is over, but the Great Depression is still rampant. All of the characters in this, similar to hard-boiled LA, all of the characters are based on real people. So, but feel free to mess with the actual futures of these characters, or change them up, change up the names or their roles so that they're not real people, if you want. So first we get some big personalities in New York, like the gossip columnist Walter Winchell, who has dirt on just about everyone, including the mob. But if you get too close to him, he's sure to pick up on something on you too. Lillian Hellman is a famous playwright and activist, while Orson Welles needs no introduction. He staged an all-black cast of Macbeth in Harlem. He was pro-union and caused huge panic with his radio broadcast of War of the Worlds. Psychic investigator Hereward Carrington and his wife Marie Sweet Carrington go around investigating people who claim to have paranormal powers. And then we'll move on to some politics. So Jimmy Walker was a playboy and somehow was elected and re-elected even after the stock market crash as the mayor of New York. But soon there was a Hofstadter committee investigating corruption in the city. And Franklin Roosevelt, the governor of New York at the time, decided it was politically expedient to force Walker out, and Fiorello LaGuardia took his place. There's a little bit more information about that, but for now we'll move on to talk about organized crime. And of course, the Sicilian mob is the big one here. So the five families took hold in the 1930s. And there was a big war between the families, specifically between the Maranzanos and the Maserias. And one of Maseria's lieutenants, Charles Lucky Luciano, switched sides. He didn't care about blood, but more about profit. And Luciano suggested forming the Commission to unite 7 Italian families. With this in place, the families can organize hits and run their business with a lot of plausible deniability. And this leads to it being called Murder Incorporated. And again, there's a lot more information there, but for the purposes of this, we'll move on to the next part, which is we get a detailed description of New York itself. Specifically, it describes Gotham, detailing uptown, midtown, downtown, and lower Manhattan, and Queens. And all of these, or not all of them, but a lot of these people and places also have scenario hooks as well. So now we move on to part 3, the adventure. From this point on, there will be spoilers, and because of the nature of one-to-one games, listening to the rest of this will really ruin the adventure for you, even more so than finding out the plot of normal RPGs. So if you haven't played it yet, please stop watching here. If you intend on running it for your player, or if you've already played it, then please keep watching. So as I mentioned in the other videos, the layout is a little bit inconsistent between the scenarios. This one starts with a section called The Story So Far and introduces the characters after that. I think this is ideal and less confusing than the other scenarios which do it in the other order. So anyway, the background is that in the early 1800s, William Herschel discovered infrared, and since then people have been wondering what else is there around us that we can't see. George Preston, a key character in our scenario, is an electrician and an amateur inventor, and he thinks he has created a machine to help us do so. And he's right, but unfortunately it worked too well. When he turned it on, it connected to another dimension and some creatures came out. It caused a lot of destruction and a man was left dead, half eaten, in George's apartment building. George feels terrible and decides the only way he can atone is to sacrifice himself to the extra-dimensional monsters and have the machine destroyed. He asks his friend to stay late one night after work to help him do it, but the friend is busy for the night. The friend doesn't know what the situation is, and George turns instead to his boss, who agrees to do it. However, when the boss sees the machine in action, he wants to sell it to the US government in case of an upcoming war with the Germans, and also to make himself pretty rich at the time. So George dies going through the portal or whatever, while the boss keeps the machine. George is now dead, and his disappearance, because he disappeared without a trace, is very suspicious to the cops, who attribute the half-eaten man in the apartment building to George. They're not sure how, but they're blaming George for his murder. Or at least they're suspicious of it. But George's boss will need all of the plans if he wants to sell the machine, and he can't find them. But there is also a medium or a leader of a temple who is looking for the plans, hoping to make contact with the other side. So that's the backstory, and next we are introduced to the characters, and this is a rather straightforward diagram when compared with the last one. And next we'll look at the scenes. As I mentioned in the other videos, there's still inconsistency between the layout of the scenarios. In the other scenarios, all of the scenes are labeled as core or alternate or something like that, and the core ones are usually have a bold outline on them. But for some reason, and I'm sure it's just an oversight, this scene map doesn't have the labels. So it's a little bit less useful, and I would advise, if you're running this, to make a note for yourself, just so you have that useful map there. I'll highlight these as we go on, just focusing on the core scenes. I'm going to go in the order in which they appear in the book, which is not necessarily perfect with this map, which is also in the book. And again, because of the number of scenes, I'm going to leave out the alternate scenes to focus on the main story. Just know that the story can be expanded to a fuller story to incorporate all the loose threads as well. So we start with Sadie's sob story. So George's fiance, Sadie Kane, comes to see Vivian Sinclair, worried about her missing fiance. She mentions that someone in George's apartment building was murdered the day before George disappeared. George went to work the next day, but he hasn't been seen since. The police came to her trying to find out where George has gone. Before this, she didn't know that George was missing, and she's been looking for him ever since. Because she's no one important and she doesn't have a lot of money, she can't afford a PI, but maybe a journalist like Vivian Sinclair could look into it for her. George works for Fuller's Electrical Repair, and sometimes Fuller lets him use the warehouse after hours to work on his own inventions. He was on the verge of an amazing breakthrough, but she doesn't know about what. And he doesn't have a lot of friends, but he grew up with Charlie, that's a female Charlie, and now they work together. So that will most likely lead to probably Fuller's Electrical Repair, his workplace, the last place he was seen, as the next point of contact. So Viv goes to check out George's workplace and finds it's surrounded by electricians hoping to get a day's work. Remember, this is during the Depression. Fuller puts his reputation on the line with high standards. If you listen to, or if you talk to the people waiting outside, you can hear that one or two of the men have been taken in to show Fuller their skills, but they must not have been good enough because they haven't been back since. You can get a little bit of information then from Fuller's secretary, but nothing super important, before meeting Fuller himself in the next scene, called Fuller Himself. So Fuller is very proud of his company, and he hires only the best. And their motto is, as good as new or your money back. He thinks Viv has come with some kind of unusual repair, or she wants business of some kind, so he really starts selling her on the company from the start. When he finds out that she's press, he answers very respectfully, and he's very aware of the power of the press, and his reputation is very important to him. He last saw George 4 nights ago when they locked up, but some of the boys the workers there, have keys to the office. Yeah, George was working on a contraption, but he never left it here. He always took it home with him. The boss Fuller says maybe it has something to do with radio waves. If prompted, or just as she's leaving, Fuller also mentions the other woman that came by, Pearl something or other, who is visiting from a temple, and he can hand over a card to Vivian. So as you're leaving, so that's the end of that scene. The next scene is Charming Charlie. As you're leaving, if you don't attempt to talk to her, otherwise, Charlie will come and seek you out. George helped her get the job. She was doing his work secretly for a while, and when Fuller was impressed by the actual improvement in quality, he had to accept the high quality and take her on as an electrician, despite being a woman. George asked her to stay late the other night, and he seemed a bit down, but she had another appointment, so she said no. She doesn't know what it was about. She thinks that maybe George might have cracked if the machine didn't work, and possibly he might have jumped off the Brooklyn Bridge. She's adamant that he couldn't possibly be a murderer, but she does hint that maybe he could rob someone. She hints as well that he might have borrowed unwisely, possibly from the mob to pay for the expensive parts for his machine. A girl came looking for George in the office, and when she heard that the device had disappeared too, she became frantic and started accusing the workers of stealing it. This is the same woman that Fuller talked to you about, Pearl from the temple. If you want to find out a little bit more, and if you reassure Charlie, you can find out that the reason she couldn't work, or she couldn't stay late with George, is that she does a little bit of rewiring off the books, which is why she wasn't able to go, and this is illegal because she's not licensed to do it. So not only could she potentially lose her job, but she might also get arrested for it. So the next place to go is probably George's apartment, and so there are 3 scenes here, all within the apartment complex. So the first one is to go to the apartment building. The police have stopped posting officers there, but the landlord is a bit of a pain. He likes his tenants to be very by the book as well and not cause any problems, and so a potential murder in the apartment building is pretty bad, and including the mess from the spilt blood that's still there. You can try and persuade him to show you up to the apartment, or you can try sneaking by him. If you go up to the Finx apartment, this is the half-eaten dead neighbor. If you go up to his apartment, there's nothing of note except for the large blood stain. But as you're kind of looking around, other tenants might come out to offer their opinion, or you can knock on doors. So that leads to the next section, or the next scene, interviewing the neighbours. So they can tell you a variety of things, but mostly the power kept flickering, and they thought that there might be a blackout coming. There were weird sounds, and then the lights came on full brightness as Finx screamed, and then it seemed to go back to normal. One of the tenants opened his door to check on what was going on, and he saw something that made him think of a floating living blimp. He suddenly slammed the door, and he had another strange incident, but he got out okay. There's whispers that maybe George might have killed Finx, but no one can think of a way that George could have disposed of half of a body, because the police were never able to find the other half. So then the final part in this apartment block is to go actually into George's apartment. So this has also been kind of checked through quite messily by the police, and they actually didn't do it. They made a big mess, but they didn't do a very thorough job. And Viv looks under the mattress and finds a load of schematics. That's the main thing here. On her way out, she almost collides with a younger woman who was crouching down and trying to pick the lock into the door. You might, depending on your roles, you might catch her or you might get outrun by her. But she can lead you to the temple of Nephitis, if I'm saying that right. But you have leads that already lead there anyway, so if you miss this one, it's fine. So let's go to the temple next anyway. In the temple, Viv can talk to Madame Isis Nefiri, who was interested in George's device, if it could help them maybe contact spirits. She describes George as a real seeker of truth, and she's convinced that George is not a killer. She only witnessed him angry once ever, and he slightly raised his voice when he was accosted by a tough-looking man who stopped him outside of the temple. And again, this is another reference to George potentially borrowing from the mob. If asked, she says yes, she has heard of a number of electricians disappearing recently. This is a reference back to some of the electricians who were queuing outside who never made it back again. If Viv didn't catch the girl at the apartment, or if she did as well, Madame Isis will call her in now to apologise, and if the girl got away with the schematics, she hands them over to Viv now. So now we look at the machine itself. So Viv has the schematics, and she can either go to Charlie with them, Charlie being a mechanic from this scenario, or Nettie, her contact. And either way, she gets the following information. The schematics are incomplete, and therefore we can't rebuild the machine like this. It looks like the core part is some kind of radio receiver, but much more complex. And it draws a lot of power, possibly causing the power surges or blackouts. And you can use this information to get in contact with the gas company to find out any reports of blackouts or surges or anything like that. If you happen to go to Charlie about this, not Nettie, it will attract the attention of Fuller, who tries to buy them from you. And given the depression situation and potentially your problems, you might need the money. But then Viv should probably get in contact with the gas company, and she can find there that there have been a number of complaints in a kind of a 5-block radius over the last few nights. Every time the maintenance crew gets there, the problem has already solved itself. The timings are always around 10:30 p.m. and Fuller's electrical repair is right in the middle of it. So then we get to the conclusion. So assuming Viv cases the joint, but there's also options for her storming it if she wants. She can wait for the strange hum and the streetlights beginning to fritz. And then if she starts peeking inside, she can see a figure tied to a chair and strange things floating around the chair. The figure in the chair will probably be Charlie, to have more of an emotional attachment to it, unless Viv was with Charlie right up until this point. So if she just got information from Charlie right before this scene, it will be someone else, one of the electricians. But as long as Viv wasn't with Charlie the whole time, it will be Charlie. The safest thing for Viv to do is to look away. But you can watch it happen, or you can try to free Charlie. Probably pretty dangerous situations. If you look away, then eventually the machine will get shut off and you'll be fine. But at some point now, Fuller is going to try and chloroform you from behind. Whether you escape or not, Fuller will come clean and say that he has hired a few electricians to try and figure it out, and he sacrifices them every night. He's developed a pattern or a habit with one of the creatures who he refers to as his pet. But not the pet is trained to come out and just grab any bodies that Fuller is feeding them. But Fuller has also looked into the great beyond, and he has seen much more terrifying things in the background than just this creature that's coming out. So it's quite worrying. If you're tied to a chair at this stage, if he chloroformed you, there's a chance that you could break free, but more likely you'll go crazy and die. If you're free, or if you can break free, you might even be able to sacrifice Fuller for this situation. And so there's a lot of variation in how it plays out, depending on how you do there. And so then we get to the denouement, the kind of the wrapping up of it. So you can go back and report whatever you want to Sadie, the truth, the full truth, or a kind of a half-truth that the machine backfired and killed him while the boss covered it up. Anything to kind of give her closure. And obviously you can come up with whatever you want. And then after this, well, obviously this happens if the player hasn't died. And after this, the player gives their closing coda as kind of a reflection on the scenario and a wrap-up as the camera kind of pans out. Okay, so that's the scenario. Overall, I felt this was a very good scenario. The story is really interesting, and I think it would be great for a player to go through it and start unraveling the mystery. And as I mentioned before, I only went through the core scenes here. There's a lot of alternate scenes that kind of flesh it out a bit more. The disappearing electricians felt a little bit unusual, although you kind of do need that evidence to kind of point towards Fuller. And I guess his love for his pet is why he's feeding them all the time. But I would have imagined that he'd just naturally be a bit more careful. But, you know, that's all. I also don't like how easily Madame Isis hands back the schematics that she sent her helper out to find. Maybe she's just trying to cozy up to Viv in hopes that she might get some access to the machine once it's found. But it seemed like she's working kind of behind the scenes to try and find information about the machine, and then as soon as someone comes up, even without a threat, she's like, here's all the schematics, here's all the information that we have. It felt like a little bit weaker for me. But overall, this is a very satisfying story. I think your player will really like going through it and uncovering the mystery. And it really leaves up so many questions about the great beyond to kind of fill your player character, fill Vivian with a real sense of dread that she's uncovering something that maybe is best left unknown. This is definitely worth your while for a one-shot that's easy to prepare and you can finish up in one session. It lays the great groundwork for you to make your own scenarios for future scenarios with Vivian Sinclair. Okay, so that is the second of the 3 scenarios in this book. The next video will look at Capital Colors, which is set in wartime Washington. But that's everything for today. If you have any comments, please leave them down below. If you've played it, or if you have a different opinion on this, please leave it below. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next video. Take it easy.